Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this weekend for our message at Deep Rivers Church. Hope all is well. If you're out of town, hope you're enjoying your time. If you're not feeling well, hope that you bounce back quickly. A couple of just real quick announcements before we get started. I actually have some visual aids to help this time. Uh, this coming Wednesday night is our prayer house where we'll be praying for the community and anything else that's on your heart. This Wednesday night, 7 p.m. I know it seems like a quick turnaround, but Deep Dive is back next weekend, the last weekend in February. We'll be diving into the topic of the Trinity. And so Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, Sunday evening, 6 o'clock. I think we averaged just over 41 people coming over the course of the weekend to Deep Dive. So if you've been missing out, come join us. Again, that's it. Women had a Bible study this morning here at the church. It was very well attended, so that's something to be celebrating about. So, yeah, I think we're all good for the announcements, if I'm forgetting something. Hey, let's just dig right in, if that's okay with you. Last week I invented a word, graping. How are you graping? How are you abiding in the vine? And the hope is that maybe once in a while somebody might say, how you graping? And kind of give a chance to remind each other that we're supposed to be abiding in the vine. There's another phrase that's more popular than that. It's how you graping is never going to become as popular as this one. It's this one. You pick your friends, but not your relatives. So obviously you have a choice in who your friends are, but you have no choice about the family that you have. And it seems like a good phrase to kind of kick off the next couple of weeks. We've been talking about cultivating God's reign and rule. And last 2 weeks it was in our hearts. Next 2 weeks will be in our home. So what can we say about the family? What could I share with you about God's reign and rule in your family? Now, I could spend some time talking about biblical roles, the biblical roles of husbands and wives and kids. Unfortunately, sometimes those roles are easy to misunderstand or abuse, and sometimes they're controversial. So that's a conversation to be had one day, but not today. Could talk about the Old Testament. Did you know, in some respects, the Old Testament is the story of one family, a good chunk of it, a very dysfunctional family that God uses far from perfect people. He redeems bad situations. So we could talk about the Old Testament stories and characters in the Old Testament, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the forefathers way back in the Old Testament. The story of one family and how God used it, as messed up as it was. Along those lines, some of our families are good, others are kind of troubled, and we do kind of carry some of that stuff. Our upbringing really can have an influence on us if we're not careful. We're all imperfect. We're all, in some way, a product of our environment. We live in a broken down house. We've used that analogy before. In some of the world we live in some respects is a broken down house, but we live in broken down homes. And so that does kind of leave an impact on us. We could talk about the fact, you're sovereignly placed in your family for a reason. God didn't make a mistake when he put you where he was. And this might seem like a stretched analogy to you, but I think it's worth considering some truth. Abraham Lincoln was in a very stressful marriage. His wife dealt with depression, and the thought is Abraham Lincoln was a better president because of the marriage that he was in, that the things that were built into his character in the middle of a stressful marriage helped him to negotiate his presidency better than maybe somebody else would. Or, and what we're going to talk about, we're not going to talk about these other four things. I could talk about, the characteristics, the attributes and actions of our lives that make us a better family member. So that's the path we're going to take this weekend. How can we cultivate our families, God's reign and rule in them, but how it starts with us. And so that's the avenue we're going to go down this weekend. The passage for the weekend is 1 Peter 4, 8 through 11. And Peter wrote this: above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should speak as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with all the strength God provides. Love each other deeply. It's the first phrase. Deeply means fervently, and I enjoy the opportunity to hit the synonym button on my computer. Deeply means fervently, passionately, ardently, enthusiastically, eagerly, zealously, intensely, vehemently. That's how we're to love one another. It's interesting. I think every newly married couple starts off like that at first. Then life happens. The endorphins wear off. The biological chemistry starts to plateau and level off a little bit. And then we start to notice the things about each other that kind of irritate and drive us crazy. And next thing I know, our love isn't deep. It's not fervent. Lots of times it just becomes a maintenance mode sort of thing, unfortunately. We are to love each other deeply. Every new parent, when they bring that baby home for the first time, has a deep and fervent, passionate, ardent, enthusiastic love for their newborn. Then come the sleepless nights and the diapers and the stress about how to pay for things, and then they become teenagers, and that's a whole other thing. So why is it hard in our families to love one another? Sometimes it's easier to love strangers than your own family. I think it's because families are full of offense. We offend each other quite often, and that's why I chose this passage that I did, because if we can kind of get some of this down, I think our families are going to experience God's reign and rule, and that would be a good thing. The phrase that we could camp out on all weekend, all morning, all evening, is love will cover a multitude of sins. I found this quote by a theologian named Wayne Grudem. He's also the one who wrote the Systematic Theology booklet. That book, it's a big book. It's not a booklet, it's a big fat book that we're kind of using as our primary source for the deep dive class. This is what he had to say about love covers a multitude of sins. Where love abounds, many small offenses and even some large ones are readily overlooked and forgotten. But where love is lacking, every word is viewed with suspicion. Every action is liable to a misunderstanding, and conflicts abound to Satan's delight. We need to expect the best out of each other and not look for offense as often as we do. Love covers the offender and the offended. Both parties benefit. When you choose not to be offended, you benefit. When those who say something that is offensive and you overlook it, you benefit as well. Both parties benefit. We're going to circle back to love covers a multitude of evils. I need a haircut. We're going to circle back to that one. But for now, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Offering hospitality is another way of saying just be nice. In fact, it's more than that. It's be proactively nice. Be nice intentionally, not in return. Offer niceness off the bat. Just don't return niceness when people are nice to you. Be proactively nice. Without grumbling. Grumbling in the original language has this feeling of muttering, low speaking, sign of displeasure. You see people kind of under their breath. That's grumbling. It's the opposite of cheerfulness. And it's easy to grumble. Too easy. couple points is let's not be surprised that a family has conflict. Um, Sometimes we're surprised. That's just kind of baked into the cake that there's going to be a measure of conflict. I don't think I've ever used that phrase, baked into the cake, in my entire life, but there it was. All relationships obviously have a level of stress and sacrifice involved, and that's kind of a part of the relationship, is that they're going to be stressed, but there's also going to be a measure of sacrifice, and that sacrifice might just be being proactively nice and not grumbling. It's a spirit. It's not just not grumbling. It's where's your heart in that. I can tell you not to grumble, not to mutter, not to low speak, not to kind of complain under your breath like we do, but it's the issue of the heart. As faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms, this is where I thought this might be something to take hold of. If we are bad stewards of God's grace, so God's given us grace, and if we're bad stewards of it, if we're bad steward of God's grace, it's as if that grace was given to us in vain. Ponder that. That grace is wasted because it only comes to us and does not move through us. So God has been gracious to all of us. I hope you recognize that. If you don't recognize God's grace on your own life, this passage isn't going to sink in as deep as it should. But that grace is wasted if it only comes to us. If we only receive God's grace, it's wasted if it does not move through us to other people. How can we be gracious with others? Only when we recognize God's grace with us. The passage goes on in its various forms. I found this little description. Various forms is a multicolored grace. Like when a ray of light breaks into a spectrum of many different colors. Each of us receive God's grace at a different angle and then reflects it back in a new and different color. So yeah, God has shown us grace with the forgiveness of our sins. He's shown us grace and mercy. And then how can we reflect that same grace back? That's a full spectrum. It's gonna look 1,000 different ways to 1,000 different people. So it's not just the same grace God has shown us. It's going to be multifaceted. It's going to be found in various forms. Love will show itself through us as we give it to others what God has given to us. And we're to be good stewards. I don't think I ever think of myself as stewarding God's grace. But we are to be good stewards of God's grace that's been given to us, recognizing it's going to spill out of us or shine out of us in all kinds of various ways. You know, in regards to this idea of God's grace, Paul added this in 1 Corinthians 15:10. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. I worked harder than all of them, he acknowledges, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Paul makes it clear that he was what he was only by God's grace. So yeah, if we want to see God's reign and rule played out in us being gracious to other people, we need to recognize God's grace. Again, the phrase, his grace to me was not without effect. His grace to me was not in vain. And how? Because Paul put his own God-inspired efforts into the work along with God's grace. So yeah, it takes some work. Families take work. I'll be honest, your marriage is probably going to be the hardest thing you're ever going to have to do in the course of your life. Sometimes being a parent is a challenging and trying thing. It might be the hardest job you ever had is living as a grace-filled person in your family. But we do it because God's been gracious to us. That's why Peter went on to write, if anyone serves, they should serve. They should do so with the strength that God provides. Again, we're putting it into the context of family this weekend, so let's insert that. If anyone lives in a family, they should do so with the strength that God provides. So let's stop wherever you're at. Let's take a moment. I want you to think of a hard situation in your family. But it's not just a situation that you don't have any influence on. You're not passive. You're not just a spectator of it. It's not like there's nothing you can do. Think of a hard situation in your family in which you do have some influence. All right. Please do not try to be a better husband on your own strength, if that's the situation. Please do not try to be a better wife with your own strength. Please do not try to be a better daughter on your own strength. Please do not try to be a better son with your own strength. Please do not try to be a better sister on your own strength. Please don't try to be a better brother on your own strength. Please don't try to be a better grandparent, aunt, uncle, niece, or nephew. Whatever your role is in your family, please don't try to do it on your own strength. Do it with the strength that God provides. I mentioned I wanted to go back to one of those first phrases, love covers a multitude of sins. And the reason we picked this passage is this is especially true in a family setting. You don't get to pick your family. You do get to pick your friends. You can be quite discerning who you want to be friends with, but you're born into your family and you have no choice about that. And that's why a truth like this can be so meaningful. Love covers a multitude of sins. Again, cover means to forgive, and forgive means that we love. Obviously, the best example for us is Jesus' death on the cross for us. But he not just forgave our sins, he did away with them. He forgot them. It's something that's a challenge for us. But on top of that, he forgave the people who were actually crucifying him. Father, forgive them. He covered our sin and forgave them at the same time. On the cross, we see two acts of love. I don't know if I've ever really pondered that. But on the cross, we see two acts of God's love. Jesus loved us by being a sacrifice for our sins, and he forgave those who were doing it because he truly realized they did not know exactly what they were doing. Love covers a multitude of sins. But First Peter is talking about interpersonal relationships, whether it's amongst friends, our church, or family. So there's a few things I think that we can continue to unpack about this in regards to the interpersonal relationships we have. And the first one is this: as believers, we do reflect the love of God by forgiving others. John 13, Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another." It's not an option. There's a commandment for us to love one another. We reflect God's love by loving others. And I know that's hard in a family. I know there's hard things that have been said and done. I know a lot of families have a lot of disconnect in them, and that might be putting it kindly. Especially when it comes to extended family, it can get really messy and tattered. But we reflect God's love by loving others in our family. 1 Corinthians 13, again, you probably knew I was going to go there sooner or later. Love keeps no records of wrongs. It leaves us willing to forgive and even forget. Now, obviously, forgetting means there's some discernment involved, but we need to do our best to keep no record of wrongs, to expect the best out of each other. The second thing I think that love does, love covers a multitude of sins in our interpersonal relationship, and I wish I could find a gentler way to say this one, but love also keeps your mouth shut. The opposite of forgiving an offense is sharing it with others. And sometimes we talk too much. It's called gossip, and it's easy to gossip about people at church and family, and how much more so with our families and our friends, I should say. So we need to be careful that we're not sharing these offenses with others. We're saying to let the love of God cover them over, and the opposite of covering them over is expressing it and sharing it with other people. 1 Corinthians 13:6 says, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. And when we're sharing bad news, we're delighting in evil. Nobody's ever, it's more, when we're sharing offenses, it's delighting in evil. It's the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing. This idea of love covers a multitude of sins, again, to put it just kind of bluntly, love ignores the small stuff. You always have a choice whether you're going to be offended or not. You always. No, it might always be an easy choice, but I truly believe you have a choice whether you're going to be offended or not. Love ignores the small stuff. Choose not to take offense at everything. Some sins may not be worth confronting. Personal slights, ignorant remarks, and minor annoyances can easily be forgiven for the sake of love. Okay? So there's a lot of little things that happen in our families that may not be indicative of a heart issue. It's just a minor annoying thing that they do, or an ignorant thing that they've said, or even a personal slight. That doesn't have to be a malintent behind that. I love this verse, Proverbs 19:11. A person's wisdom yields patience. All right. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. It's to your glory if you choose not to be offended, to overlook an offense. When we're patient and when we're merciful, we're much less likely to take an offense. We need to be willing to extend mercy, not giving people what they really do deserve. That's grace. We talked about this at the last deep dive class. Grace is God giving us what we do not deserve. And there are opportunities where you can show grace to other people. You give them something they don't deserve. But maybe realistically, there's more chance for us to show mercy. People have offended. They have done something wrong. And we do not give them what they do deserve. That's showing mercy. And when we show mercy, we're less likely to take an offense. And the last thing is, just to make sure we're clear on this, love also values truth. Covering over a sin, love covers a multitude of sins, as the verse says. Covering over is not ignoring it, but it is evidence. It's not ignoring it. Let's just leave it at that. But is this offense, is it an evidence of the heart, or is it carelessness? This offense, why? Is it evidence of a heart issue that needs to be addressed, or is it a careless thing? We be careful not to be thrown by such little things. Again, we oftentimes expect the worst out of others. It's not disregarding our emotions or ignoring our personal boundaries. It's denying that something hurt us, but we cover a sin by acknowledging it. We cover sin by acknowledging it and then extending the forgiveness God has forgiven us to others. Okay? So we do acknowledge the hurt, but we also then extend forgiveness, the same forgiveness that God has given to us. And again, 1 Corinthians, love is patient, love is kind, does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. The question, and maybe the real problem to unpack, is when you are in a family, any situation, but specifically in a family, and somebody does something to offend you, it's an issue of two hearts. It's not just their heart, it's yours as well. So the question is, why is it hard to overlook an offense? Why is it hard to let the little things go? One possibility to consider, maybe there's a fear of injustice. that you feel like you're getting cheated. And we want to live in a just world. We kind of unfortunately want to live in a tit for tat world, for lack of a better phrase. So maybe we're afraid to overlook an offense because we don't think that's fair, or we're getting cheated, or it's not even. Then the question is, how does your pride work into this topic? How does your pride possibly make it harder to overlook an offense? And the second question is, who offends you? Who offends you often, and how can you show grace to them? And this is the key. It's an undeserved grace. Your grace, the grace God gave you, is undeserved. Are you willing or able to extend that same undeserved grace to somebody else? So again, love covers a multitude of sins. That doesn't mean we ignore the things that happen, but it's worth exploring, why has this person done what they've done? Why have they said what they've said? Is it an issue of the heart? And sometimes things need to get addressed, but maybe not everything. And how can we extend forgiveness? How can we expect the best? How can we extend grace to each other? Especially in our families. That might be the biggest challenge of all. All right, well, thanks so much. Take care. God bless. Well, maybe we'll see you Wednesday night at Prayer House. Hopefully we'll see you at the deep dive, as we discussed, a deep dive into the Trinity. It's been fun to put that together. So we're looking forward. Take care. God bless.